Hello and welcome to an overview of how to configure a vRealize Operations Manager cluster for the first time. Note that a vRealize Operation Manager environment can consist of a single node or a multi-node cluster. Here we have our running node, and let's go ahead and connect to it for the very first time. Let's enter the node name in the URL address field of our browser, and we're automatically routed to the vRealize Operations Manager initial setup screen. Here we see several setup options, with the Express installation being the quickest and easiest way to set up a single node and cluster. Simply provide a chosen administrator password, then the system will configure all the other options with default values. This selection is most appropriate where growth beyond a single cluster node is not anticipated. The new installation option is for setting up the first node in a vRealize Operations Manager cluster. It provides access to advanced configuration options that are not available in the Express installation. The Expand an Existing Installation option is for adding more nodes to a cluster where the first node has already been configured. In this overview, we will set up a brand new multi-node cluster, so let's select New Installation. As noted on this workflow screen, in a new installation, the first node configured takes the role of master. We supply a password that meets the complexity requirements noted on screen, click Next, and now we see certificate options. If we have generated our own certificate, let's browse to it and install it from here. In our case today, though, let's use the self-signed certificate from this vRealize Operations Manager appliance. Next, we'll enter the name of this node in the Node Name field. In the NTP Server Address field, let's enter our Active Directory domain controller to provide an external time sync to this master node. All other nodes in this cluster will sync their time with this master node. If we leave the NTP field blank, the master node will use its own internal clock for timekeeping, but best practice is to provide an external NTP server for the master node. This screen shows a diagram of the next steps to configure the vRealize Operations Manager application to meet management and monitoring goals. As we click Finish, it takes us to the administration interface for the very first time. Notice the status message, Preparing Node for First Use. Node preparation will take a few seconds. We now have our first vRealize Operations Manager node configured. Note that the cluster role for this node is set to master. To demonstrate setup of a multi-node cluster, a few additional nodes have been spun up in the background. Now let's look at how to add them into this cluster. We have entered the URL for Node 2 in the browser, and because we have not yet configured this node, we are taken to the vRealize Operations Manager initial setup screen. Since we already have a master node configured, Node 1, we select Expand an Existing Installation to add Node 2 to the cluster. Here, a workflow diagram shows the various options for expanding an existing cluster. Click Next, and then supply the node name. We now have the option to select whether it will be a data node or a remote collector. We select data node since this node is on the same local network as our other clustered nodes, and it should fully participate in all data services. Next, we supply the IP address or fully qualified domain name of the master node we prepared in the previous step. Enter the FQDN of the master node, and then click the Validate button. The certificate thumbprint of the master is displayed, so we check the box to accept that certificate. Then click Next. Using the administrator password we configured during the initial setup of the master node, we can add this node to the cluster. Please note we have the option to use a temporary passphrase to join this node to the cluster, which is useful when you want others to temporarily have the ability to add a node to the cluster, but don't want to give them the credentials to access the cluster administration UI. To generate a passphrase, we need to access the administration UI from any cluster node. Here, let's switch back to the master node administration page, and with the master node highlighted, click the Generate Passphrase icon. We can specify how many hours the passphrase will remain valid, then click the Generate button. Notice the text says it will expire after one use. Let's copy and paste the passphrase in the corresponding field on Node 2. Here we see the familiar diagram outlining next steps after the node joins the cluster. As we click Finish, we're taken to the administration UI where we see the status message that this node is preparing for first use. Now the node is not yet a member of the cluster, so we will not see the master node in the clusters section. Once the node is finished preparing, the administration page reloads in the browser. Here, we're back to the main administration login screen. Because we did not give this user the administration password to add this node to the cluster, they're dropped out of the administration UI once the node configuration is complete. If we had given the admin password instead of the temporary passphrase, they would remain in the admin UI and be able to perform other cluster operations. Now let's switch back over to the master node to check the cluster status. In the cluster node section, click the refresh button, and we see that node 2 has indeed joined the cluster and has assumed the role of a data node. Now let's continue and add the third node to the cluster. We select Expand an Existing Installation, clicking past the familiar cluster expansion diagram, and we input the node name and select the type as a data node. We enter and validate the master node FQDN and accept the certificate. This time we use the admin password. Click Next, and as we see the familiar Next Steps diagram, let's click Finish. Arriving at the vRealize Operations Manager Administration UI, we see the familiar Preparing Node for First Use message. Once the node preparation is complete, the administration UI page is reloaded in the browser. And because we use the admin credentials instead of a temporary passphrase to join the node to the cluster, we remain logged into the administration UI on this node. We see node 3 in the cluster list, along with the other 2 cluster nodes that were prepared previously. Now continuing with the fourth and final node, let's expand an existing installation, click past the cluster expansion diagram, enter the node name, and this time select Remote Collector as the node type. A remote collector is used when there is a high latency link to a collection location, such as a wide area network link to a remote office. A remote collector does not participate in clustered data services, nor does it offer the product UI. Instead, it pushes the data from the remote location over the WAN link to the main cluster for processing by data nodes. Just like any other node, to join a remote collector to a cluster, we enter and validate the master node and its certificate. Accepting the certificate, we click Next, and enter the administration password, and click Finish. In the administration UI, we see Preparing Node for First Use, and when the preparation of this node is complete, the administration UI page reloads in the browser. We now see all 4 nodes in the cluster section with their corresponding roles correctly assigned. And at this point, we have a couple of options. We can enable high availability if we're properly licensed and wish to use that feature, or we can start the vRealize Operations Manager cluster now without enabling HA. We have the option to enable HA at a later time, even if the cluster has already been running. Let's enable HA before starting the cluster. Clicking the Enable button, we're presented with a list of nodes that could be selected as the master replica node. Note that we do not see node 4 in this list. Remember, node 4 is a remote collector and therefore does not participate in data services. Let's choose node number 2 as the master replica, click the Enable High Availability for this cluster box, and click OK. High availability status is enabled and the HA button has changed from enabled to disable. In the cluster node section, we see node 2 has now assumed the role of master replica. At this point, let's go ahead and start vRealize Operations Manager. When clicking the Start button, a prompt appears advising us to make sure we have adequate numbers of nodes to manage our environment efficiently. If so, click Yes to start the application. The startup process may take a few minutes to complete. During that time, we'll see a variety of status messages indicating the progress. Notice the message Starting or Restarting Cluster for Initial Installation. The node status now shows Waiting for Analytics for all nodes except the remote collector, which is already online. Remember, remote collectors do not run data analytics services, so they go online much quicker than full data nodes. Now we see the nodes are all online, and the status of the cluster is Installing Solutions. This means the VMware vSphere solution is being installed, which is the last phase of setting up the cluster. The cluster now shows a status of Online, and the Start button has changed to Take Offline. To conclude, we've now successfully configured a running 4-node high-availability vRealize Operations Manager cluster. For more information on vRealize Operations, please visit vmware.com/go/VROps. Thank you.